created us has not changed
To glorify
in the
God.
last 2 years.
That's it. That's it.
So we're going to talk more about that tonight. I'm going to show you something kind of interesting from the secular world that I think you'll find of interest tonight. But we want to just sort of continue where we ended off last week. And as you know, we began in chapter 3, I think, of the book. I think we ended at page 56, or we're on page 56, just so you'll know. And so what we're looking at now, we've moved away from trying to understand God's realm. That's probably the deepest part of our subject. And we've moved away from that because everybody's got that. You understand, you could explain God's eternal now. And you understand eternity and timelessness, and you've got that down. So we can now move on past that and look at the next thing that we've got to understand, foundational to understanding how God sees death, and that is God's purpose for creating man. And I'm going to show you later how these things fit into understanding death through the eyes of God. But you're going to use these things that you're learning now when we get to chapters 10 and 11, which is really the thesis of the book, looking at God's perspective on death. But we've got to grasp about three things before we look at some of these deeper, difficult passages. And so the second thing we're looking at is, why did God create us? We started that last week. And we've gone through passage after passage after passage that clearly shows us that God created us to glorify Himself. Now, after looking at those passages, if we don't want to just take the Bible to confirm why God created us, we can look to other sources. And on page 56 is where I'm at. But I write about the fact that the best confession of faith out of the Protestant Reformation can be found probably in the Westminster Shorter Catechism. And very clearly it states in this catechism, this is a statement by Protestants claiming their belief system, their doctrine of belief. And very clearly we read, the chief end of man is to glorify God and enjoy Him forever. And so we found it in the Bible, and now we find it in other writings outside, extra-biblical writings, we call them. Anything that's not written by a prophet of God is extra-biblical. And so we find confirmation of this in extra-biblical text. But now it raises the question, and that is, what does it mean to glorify God? The Old Testament prophets and the Old Testament writers seem to understand God's purpose in creating man. And I know those of you that have been in Old Testament with me, we have gone through this several times, and so some of this is going to be repeat for you, but as Liv says, I think it's good to do that.
I'll repeat when I get.
Yeah, because that helps us all. I think we all learn better that way. But Moses wrote this. He writes, all the earth shall be filled with the glory of the Lord. Now, as I stated there, we often see this passage as maybe God sort of lighting up the earth with His luminescence, His love. We call sometimes it Shekinah. And so that's how we tend to think of that. Though in doing so, I think sometimes we fail to grasp the more significant understanding of what is being written here. And this is how man will glorify God. And Moses continues his writing, and he says, what does the Lord your God ask of you? Now, keep in mind, Moses is writing the inspired word of God. Okay? So he's the one penning these words, but these are words inspired to him by God. And so he writes in Deuteronomy 10, what does the Lord your God ask of you but to fear the Lord your God, to walk in all His ways, to love Him, to serve the Lord your God with all of your heart and with all of your mind, and to observe the Lord's commands and decrees. What Moses is writing here is how we will glorify God. A lot of people had this idea. I've had some people express to me that they think heaven's going to be boring because we're going to be on our hands and knees and we're going to be just praising God with our hands up and down. And when we have that understanding, we fail to understand what it means to glorify God. And Moses gives us an excellent understanding here of what it means to glorify God when he says, what does the Lord your God ask of you? What does God want from us? To fear the Lord your God, to reverence God, okay? To walk in all of his ways, to walk Christ-like, to love him, to serve the Lord your God with all of your heart and with all of your mind, and to observe the Lord's commands and decrees. When we do those things, we're glorifying God. We need to get away from this idea that we're going to spend eternity on our knees just bowing before God. We'll want to do that, I'm certain. But anything that we do that follows God's commands, that shows reverence to God, a fear of God, obedience to God, trust in God, all of those things glorify God. Why were we created?
To glorify God.
To glorify God. How will we glorify God? By obeying his commandments, by loving him, by reverencing him, by trusting in him. These are how we glorify God. So let's get away from this idea that we're going to spend eternity just on our knees. Yeah, that sounds a little bit boring to me. But no, we're going to glorify God in our acts of obedience and trust and faithfulness to God.
In heaven? You're talking
In
about
heaven, yeah.
Can I just ask a question for Nancy?
For Nancy.
Nancy, my sister wanted me to ask you a question.
Should we identify that Nancy
Nancy's
is
my
a-
sister.
Mhm.
She's Catholic. She's
Okay.
a Catholic sister.
Catholic
Yeah, she's
sister.
yeah, all my sisters are Catholic, except Eddie.
We won't
But
call
anyway,
that.
yeah, right, yeah. But she
I don't-
wanted to know how, if so many people are in heaven, and Jesus is supposedly in his glorified body,
Mhm.
how so many people can be with Jesus at one time.
Mhm.
Yeah.
How Jesus maybe we don't know the answer to that question, but Jesus in his form, his risen form up in heaven, can be with so many people
Okay.
at one time. How
We all see
everybody
this-
can be with him.
Well, it's
We
the
all see the
same as
same
the
moon.
Pope giving his speech at the St. Peter's Basilica, whatever, when he comes out of the little window, his Pope window, and the square.
Yeah, I
full
know.
of
I don't
Catholics.
think so because
No.
that's not as many people.
That's right.
I mean, there's people from
But
all the.
It's the same idea, just
No.
on a grander scale.
No, I think it's gonna be.
No.
I think it's gonna be just like down here because he's omnipresent.
That's it.
How can he hear one prayer, maybe here in the United States, and hear another prayer in Africa at the same time?
I can answer that because of Tom Lee Howell taught me he's omnipresent, he's God, he's everywhere to everybody. Tom Lee Howell told me that.
Well, that's
Yeah.
like we can all see the same moon. We'll see the same sun.
No, the people in Japan aren't looking at it at the same time we are.
Yeah, but they still see the.
She's saying we're all going to be looking at the same time.
Yeah, I think the answer to that probably, I think Pokey and Gale have narrowed in on it very well. It brings up the same question of how can God be omnipresent? How can God be everywhere all at once? Perhaps if we understood what our glorified bodies
Yeah.
will be like, we might better be able to answer that question. And we don't. But we can't really give a definitive answer of how it is that God can be everywhere at once, omnipresent. And so I think for us to try to grasp that is like trying to grasp God's eternality. How can God never have been created? How can he always have been and never will end? I think that to answer that really probably has to do with the fact that we accept God as being omnipresent, meaning he's everywhere all at once. And so I think the same application probably applies to how we will all be able to worship and even see Christ simultaneously.
What
I
about
think the
that
same
third
answer
part-
probably applies.
Third part of
So-
the Trinity too, the Holy Spirit.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, say again, I think that's some.
Now, what about the third part of the Trinity? The Holy Spirit's going to be there.
And is it going to be
And
three
he dwells
different
in our
entities?
souls, will it not?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
Is it going to be three different entities like that? Is it going to be the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit when we get there? Are we going to
I think
see?
it's something we don't know really.
See, I was
Well,
told
I
by
know
a
we see the Father and
pastor,
the Son.
I was told by a pastor that we're not going to see God. We are going to just see Jesus.
Yeah, well,
See, and
Scripture's
that's, you
pretty
know,
clear that no one has seen
Mhm.
God. God is
Yeah.
spirit, and no
Right.
one has seen God. No one can
Mhm.
see God and live. And I think what we will see, what we'll picture, is Christ Himself,
Mhm.
who is God, part of that.
Trinity.
Part of that Trinity, that third essence, that third nature of God.
Mhm.
And I think if that's how our glorified bodies operate, and I think the issue is we don't really know how are these glorified bodies, what kind of bodies are they really
Mhm.
going to
Yeah.
be?
But I could see how Don would say that.
Yeah.
I didn't think of.
I mean, you can
that
think of it as a
being like-
microcosm, but how many thousands of people, 80,000, 100,000 people that are in a stadium watching,
Yeah,
The Pope or
yeah,
you know what I mean? You can
So
put
it
it
would
on,
be like
on
that on a
kind of
grander
level
scale.
to understand it.
yeah.
You know, they're all in the concert
Uh-huh.
together watching Casting Crowns or whatever
Yeah.
in the center of the stage. And
Right.
you have 100,000 people. For
And
God, that's
would
not a
work it out.
problem.
Right, right.
Yeah, I think our problem,
Because
Yeah.
God's God. I mean,
Right.
He could,
Yeah,
have, on two-dimensional scale, thinking on man's level,
right.
you could have a massively huge stadium and He's in the center.
Yeah, right. Like
yeah, and I think a lot of that
Like
has to
space
do
and time,
with
yeah.
trying to answer those types of questions from an earthly perspective, because that's all we have
Right.
to go on is an earthly perspective,
Yeah.
whereas we won't be using an earthly perspective in
Yeah.
heaven.
And maybe she wasn't really trying to find an answer. She was just thinking, how can it be? How could, how you wonder, you're just
Overwhelmed
wondering,
by that,
how
yeah.
could it
Yeah.
be? She wasn't doubting or anything. She was just thinking, wow, how could all those people, everybody see Jesus at the same time? Because, do you have to wait in line to see him? In other words,
Yeah.
you don't.
Yeah, you're right.
you know?
Yeah, that
Yeah,
makes
it's like, well,
sense.
I want to see Jesus
That
today. No,
makes
it's my
sense.
turn. I want to see him.
It's
Like, wait, I have a
Yeah,
question.
trying
There
to
you go.
grab his
Well,
attention.
we're
Yeah.
living in God's realm. There's no gonna be no such time as waiting on
That's
Jesus.
it.
Right.
There you go.
And this thing about bowing on your knees and,
Yeah.
and being bored, I won't be there
Yeah.
because we're in His realm.
Mhm.
That's the way I feel.
Yeah.
Every eye shall see him when he comes back.
That's it. Exactly right.
Every knee.
I mean, we might not can figure that out, but I'm quite sure he's got it.
Yeah, that's right.
And I was thinking, you made me think about, we were at church at Benton Heights Sunday, and during part of the service, a lot of people went down to the altar and they were praying, and they were all praying out loud. And I was thinking, you think about God is hearing all those
Yes.
prayers, and it sounded jumbled. It didn't sound like English,
Mhm.
but God hears those prayers in all
Exactly.
kinds of languages all over the. Think about it,
Mhm.
all over everywhere.
I sound like an old timey church.
That's what I was thinking. Amen.
Yeah, and there's a great passage, it's, I think Deuteronomy 29, if I'm not mistaken. It says the secret things belong to the Lord our God. And so even as Dwight Moody once said, he expects that there are some mysteries about God that we just can't explain.
That's it.
So how some of those things will actually operate, I think it's one of those things that we have to just accept that it can be, even
That's
though we
it.
may not know how.
Tom, who was it that was writing? I don't know. I'm not learned like you are. Who was it that was writing the Bible and God told him no, leave that out?
Oh, yeah.
Who was that? They don't need to know that.
It was John.
Was
Paul?
it John, Paul? He was writing something,
John.
and God told
Small
him
epistle.
John.
leave that out.
First or second, third John. It could be in Revelation somewhere in there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure myself. Even.
Okay,
It
but
was John.
that's a good answer to a question like that. We don't know.
Yeah.
There's so much we don't know, but like you said, the day we look at God, well, we will know.
Mm-hmm.
You know.
Yeah, Don?
But,
Well, the other thing I think of on that note, and we kind of see it in a scale in our own house, my son is 2 years old.
mhm.
If I talk to him about organic chemistry,
Yeah,
he's lost.
of course. Yeah.
If I talk
I'm
to
big
him about
lost.
how a car works, even something simple like turning on the ignition, he's lost. So things that we look at that are very, very easy, you know, at our age, it's, if you flip it, it's like God knowing this, which is very, very easy, and we're the 2-year-old. We just don't have the knowledge, the experience of the brain pan to just
That's a good
conceptualize it.
Yeah.
And that's how I look at it.
Yeah.
You know, when I sometimes wonder why he does things, well, you know, he's so much far ahead of us. You know, I look at it that level. Like when I'm a child, I can't comprehend organic chemistry, but now I can.
Yeah, it's sort of like me in automobiles. I don't have a clue how the doggone thing, the engine works. But I know that it's going to work when I turn the key and hit the gas. I know that it'll work.
Well,
I
you
just
gotta
don't
put
know
gas in
how.
it.
Not always, right then.
Right.
See, what we don't know now will make it a whole lot better then, though.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think
What to
that's
look forward to.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
What we don't know now
Yeah.
will just be better
That's it.
at that time.
I think there's a lot of things that God didn't write for us because He knew we wouldn't understand.
There you go.
You know,
That's what
there's
you're
just
talking
a lot of
about
things.
leaving out.
Absolutely.
We won't until we get there.
Yeah, there
It's
seems
too hard to understand me. It's too much to take in.
Yeah.
there seems to be something about faith that God truly loves.
Yes.
So we read in Hebrews that without faith it's impossible to please God. And every passage that we have regarding our salvation is key to belief or faith
Right.
in Him. And it's always interesting to me that there's something about faith that God truly loves. And so because He loves those who step out in faith, maybe that's a valid reason for Him not revealing things to us. We're supposed to just take
Faith.
some things on faith. And so, and in fact, we're going to talk about faith in the next couple of weeks or so, because I think that's so important to master. But yeah, I think it's one of those things, Kathy, where we just accept that it can be. But, you know, how exactly it's going to work, I don't think Billy Graham can tell you.
Yeah.
There you go.
But it's going to make heaven so much better when we find.
Yeah.
Oh, I
Yeah.
didn't.
There you
Sometimes
go.
I think our human brains aren't meant to
That's right.
comprehend all that.
Yeah.
I think mine would just blow up.
Well, another
I don't
thing.
have enough hard drive.
Yeah, I'm same way. I'm certainly lacking that. But and then one of the other things that's interesting when we get to the chapter on NDEs, near-death experiences that people claim to have had. And I think I told you a week or so ago that one of the commonalities that people have is that people who have claimed these experiences most always claim that they have no concept of time. Time just doesn't seem to be part of that realm. Well, it's interesting that we've been studying that God lives outside of time. But another aspect, another commonality too, is that many of these people have reported that when they're asked, well, how did you know this or that? And their response is almost always, you just know. You just know. You don't have to really learn, you just sort of know. And whether it'll be that way in heaven or not, I don't know. But it's just interesting that these people all point to some of these commonalities and report the same type of thing. And I sort of have the feeling that's how it will be in God's eternal realm. We'll just know. We'll just know. And we won't have to learn. We won't have to go to school. We won't have to take classes like this. I think we'll just know that we want to know. But nobody knows how that's going to work. As I said, even Billy
Well,
Graham.
if you have a
doesn't.
class up there, assign me in.
Yeah, okay. If we have classes up there, I can assure you one thing. I won't be teaching them. Somebody far brighter than me will be teaching them.
Don't
So,
say never.
well, let's just jump back just to sort of add further to how we will glorify God. I quote the words of Solomon. The conclusion, when all has been heard, is fear God and keep His commandments. Well, again, we have Moses telling us how we're going to glorify God by trusting in Him, by obeying His commandments. We have Solomon writing something similar to that, to fear God or to reverence God and to keep His commandments. Those things glorify God. And so, again, we need to get over the idea that we're just going to be on our hands and knees the whole time. No, anything that we do that's pleasing to God glorifies God. And so I just said that in my note, keeping God's commandments is glorifying God.
Tom,
Yes.
when you get this old, you look forward to getting on your knees.
Yeah. My problem is I don't look forward to getting back up.
Getting back up, yeah.
That's the problem.
Really?
That's
right.
Well, Isaiah certainly clearly understood these things. He writes, everyone, and these are the words of God that he's writing, everyone who is called by my name and whom I created for my glory, whom I formed, even whom I have made. Now, we've looked at that passage before, but that is such a key passage that tells us clearly why God created us. It states it right here in these very words of God himself that Isaiah simply pens. Everyone who's called by my name and whom I created, why? For my glory. And so we have a telling passage, I think, that Isaiah writes here. Isaiah goes on further to write, see, I have refined you. For my own sake I do this, and I will not yield my glory to another. Now, there's another passage that might seem at first glance, gosh, it seems like a bit of an ego trip for God. But we've got to understand who this God is that we're talking about. He's again, vastly more magnificent and awesome than we can even comprehend. And so we've got to try to grasp that. The passage continues on, like cattle that go down to the plain, that they were given rest by the Spirit of the Lord. This is how you guided your people to make for yourself a glorious name. Again, clearly, over and over and over again, we see that we were created to glorify God. Now, why do we keep repeating this? Because grasping and understanding of that is going to be essential to us when we get a little bit further. Now, I'm still on page 58 is where I'm at. And some of this I don't want to overlook, so I'm just going to read and then we can talk about it a little bit. So I just state it's quite clear that the Old Testament writers recognize that the whole purpose of man is to glorify God. Yet it seems equally clear that the authors of the New Testament books also understood God's purpose in creating man. And Paul writes of this in several places. He addresses the church at Colossae, and he writes, for by him all things were created, both in the heavens and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. What he's doing is trying to encompass everything. He's trying to get across to his readers that God created everything. And so he's trying to define that so that people will grasp the point. It doesn't matter whether they're things that are visible that we can see or invisible that we can't see. It doesn't matter whether we're talking about things in the heavens, things on earth. It doesn't matter whether we're talking about kings or rulers or throne or powers, people with authority. It doesn't matter. All things have been created through him and for him. And so Paul is quite clear on this to his readers. And so we have New Testament confirmation about that. And so as we said before, it's pretty clear that life is not about us. Mm-hmm. Now we've said that before, but I keep repeating it because I want you to really grasp it, because we're going to play off of that as we go a little bit further in this. But clearly, Scripture tells us and shows us that life is not about us. It's all about God. We were created for him. We were created to glorify him. And this was a fundamental teaching of Jesus himself. A lot of us hold the idea that life is about us and that we are in control of every step of our future. But this is not what the prophet Jeremiah says. Great passage in Jeremiah 10:23. Many of you know this passage. I know, O Lord, that a man's life is not his own. It's not for man to direct his steps. What are we talking about there? What is Jeremiah talking about? Well, he's talking about the sovereignty of God. I know, O Lord, that a man's life is not his own. It's not up to man to direct his steps. We're talking clearly about the sovereignty of God. We're even talking about election there, which we'll speak about a little bit later. But clearly we can see that life isn't about us as we look at prophet after prophet or New Testament writer after New Testament writer. Now, I made a bunch of notes here that I want to kind of go through with you because I want to cover some of these things. But many Christians, I say, will agree that life is not about them and that it's about God. But what I want us to do is grasp not just a superficial understanding of this. I want us to grab what we're really saying when we say life is about God. Life is not about me. We say that, a lot of people say that, a lot of Christians say it, but I'm not convinced that people have thoroughly understood this and understood the depth of what this really means. And that's what I hope for us to be able to find as we go through this. So if we want a deeper understanding about death and God's perspective on death, I think that we've just got to grasp the deeper meaning of this claim that life is not about me, life is all about God. We were created to glorify God. I think we've got to grasp a deeper meaning of that, and I hope that some of that deeper meaning will come out as we go through this tonight and next week. But we've got to understand and grasp the idea that in the hands of God, death has a totally different meaning than that we hold from an earthly perspective. And that's where we're headed towards, is trying to understand God's perspective on death as opposed to an earthly perspective that we generally hold regarding death. And again, that's where we're headed. And how are we going to unravel that? Well, I think we'll unravel it when we start to understand some fundamental things about God, such as his realm, his eternal realm that he exists in, why he created man, and then later how it is that God could use death to glorify himself. How could death possibly bring glory to God? And so that's where we're headed, but I think it's going to take an understanding of those fundamental things if we're going to be able to peer through the eyes of God and see death as God sees death. And so I just said, when we understand that death in the eyes of God is simply another event locked into his eternal realm. I describe death a lot in the book as an event, where we tend to have a different idea about death from our earthly perspective. In fact, many people, even many Christians, see death as the most tragic event that can happen in a person's lifetime. And I suggest to you that it is not a tragic event, particularly through the eyes of God. I mean, how else is it that the psalmist could write that precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of his saints? How could that possibly be if death is the most tragic event of a person's life? So I think we've got to try to unravel that to understand what is meant by this. Obviously, when we read those words, the precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of his saints, then it should ring a bell with all of us that, wow, death must be seen differently by God. Because we would never generally describe death as precious. We do everything we can to avoid death. Come on now, you know that's true. Mm-hmm. We spend vast amounts of money trying to put off death. Yep. In fact, this country, I think I quoted in here, but this country spends over $22 billion a year in pharmaceuticals, procedures, medical procedures, healthcare things, anything we can do to live a little longer. We'll do anything we can. We'll dip into our life savings and spend that just to buy another year or another month or another week of life.
You know, Tom, I must be good, and I'll tell you why. I was talking today about, this being breast cancer month, and every time I go to my doctor, they give me the form, I just take it on and throw it in the trash can. I ain't gonna go have my mammogram. Ben asked me today, he said, "Oh, you go?" I said, "No, I ain't gonna have one." Why? I said, "I don't want one." So, I mean, and that may sound crazy, but that's me.
Yeah.
So, he said, "Well, what was something happened?" And I told him, I said, "I don't care. I don't, because I know where I'm going. When I go get, I just don't, that's just me. I've had two.
I was wondering if you ever had one.
And I bet everybody here is thinking, God, that woman's stupid.
No, but I know where you're coming from, because it's like.
No, that's me with colonoscopies.
Yeah, if you don't have one it's like kind of like a racket. Once you have one every year, and if you'll get a little thing that says you're overdue by a certain amount, and I'm like, really? You can have a problem a day after you have one.
Well, both times I've been, she's given me a prescription to go get my mammogram, and I just go home and throw it in the trash can.
Yeah, we've got to be careful. Don, I think you have your hand there.
Well, I say if you're a Christian, your whole motivation in life is that we're all dying to go
Yes.
to heaven.
Yes, yes, yes.
Why do we spend all that money?
I don't know.
Well, we're not going to heaven.
I'm just weird.
Yeah.
I think Dolly has a point that I was going to try to make. Is I think we've got to be careful about stepping over the boundaries. Remember, Paul himself, after getting a glimpse of heaven, he desired very much
Yeah.
to go on, to leave this life and go on. He had a glimpse of it. He knew what was waiting for him. If we had a glimpse of it as Paul did, we probably would be
Amen.
as anxious as him also. Okay? But I think we've got to be careful about treading this fine line. Some people ask me often about suicide, people taking their life. You know, is that an unforgivable sin? Well, no, it's not. But it's not what God wants for us.
Right.
And I think that God has given us intelligent minds to be able to understand things and do medical procedures and improve our life on this earth and so forth. So I think we've got to be careful about stepping over those lines.
Not stepping over the line.
Well, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying I think we've got to weigh that and be careful
Mistaken.
about that.
Be careful, be careful, so.
Because as we're going to see, hopefully tonight, we may not get to it tonight, but as we're going to see, God has a purpose for each of us. I know you know that.
Yeah.
We're going to look at a young lady who you would think there was no purpose in her life. Medically speaking, she was ripped apart. Well, I'll show you here in a little bit. We'll talk about that. But I think I can show you where God is able to use us regardless of our circumstances. And so I think it is prudent on our part to take care of ourselves so that we can fulfill that which God calls us to do. But at the same time, I think we should have an understanding of death, that it's not something that should fear us. It's something that we should accept and recognize what it means when we're talking about death. But I think as long as we're here and God has plans for us, I think we should do that which we can to keep ourselves able. That's one of the prayers that I pray every single day in my prayers, is that God will not take me before He's utilized me for the purpose of which He created me. To me, that's one of the saddest things I can think of, is to live your life and die and never have been used by God. I can't think of anything to me that's more sad than that. And so I think it behooves me to keep myself, physically well and strong so that I can be used by God. And so I guess I'm just suggesting we've got to be careful about stepping over the line.
But on the other hand, I mean, that's the only way we got to get to heaven.
Exactly. That's the only road. We've talked about this before, but there's one road only, and Christ Himself established that. We didn't establish that, Christ did. And so that's how we enter the doors of the kingdom. But again, using Paul as our example, Paul recognized that God had need of him to continue taking the gospel message to where the gospel needed to be taken. And so Paul recognized that there was a greater need for him to do that in spite of his earnest desire to step out of this earthly body and go to be with Him. And so I think we need to recognize that as well. God has a purpose for us, and as long as He does, I think it behooves us to care for ourselves so that we can accomplish that. That makes sense?
Yeah, especially if we obey Him.
Yeah.
And use that purpose.
That's
Right.
yes.
Right.
But I agree with what you and Dolly said. I have prostate cancer, simple blood test. David would need to do a biopsy. Okay, fine. Well, yeah, you got it. Okay. So now next month, December, I got to have another biopsy. Okay, thank goodness we're going to do that. I don't want to die a horrible death of prostate cancer if I can prevent it. If he comes back next time and says it's getting worse, then we're going to have surgery. we're not going to do the second step. Me and Judy done talked about it. We're going to go straight to surgery. I'm not going to do all that. But why, like colonoscopy, why die of colon cancer? An awful, awful death. If a simple test and a procedure, and you can still keep serving the Lord. In your testimony, I had cancer. I have cancer. I'm being treated. God is good.
All the time.
Yeah, and we have loved ones too to think
Yes,
about.
yes.
in that. But I think where we have to be careful is our state of mind. If we're diagnosed with some terminal disease that is just not
There you
operable,
go.
I think the thing that we need to learn from this is that death isn't something that we should fear. We should joyously anticipate it, but not in a means that draws us to want to take our life or end our life.
Exactly.
sooner. But I think we should joyously anticipate.
Oh, yeah.
death.
Yeah, not like you, of course. I think we all agree. Pokey, you're eat up with cancer. Okay, make me comfortable. In the meantime, I'm going to go to my church. I'm going to spread the word. Like me and Danny Presley were talking up there last Monday about your book, Faith. Like in a room full of people. And I plainly and proudly said, listen, I buried my baby, but I still got faith. Now, I'm still serving my God. That's got to mean something to somebody.
Absolutely.
And the room was deathly quiet. And everybody doing like that. Yeah. Okay, go ahead. I'm
And those
sorry.
words are probably touching people that
Absolutely.
you never know.
Absolutely.
Maybe somebody that don't even say anything.
Really?
Yeah,
Yes, sir.
exactly.
Yes, sir.
You know, there may be somebody that went home and really started thinking about it.
There's a girl that come to Lee Park. I have been working on her for a couple years, just inviting here and there, and her mother came Sunday. Absolutely, I loved it.
Sometimes it just takes.
Yes, sir. Just keep.
But that could be our greatest witness.
Exactly. That's
You know,
absolutely. Yes.
Not
Yes.
that we purposely want to die, but
No.
if God has that plan for us, that how we handle that
Yes.
Yes.
can be a big witness.
Yeah, that state of mind, I think, is what we've got
Yeah.
to look at. Bonnie, I know you had something.
Francis.
Francis.
I was thinking, we were talking about, we have a friend that some of you probably saw, we had our anniversary thing, that's in a wheelchair. He is in that wheelchair, it's a bed wheelchair, he has ALS.
Oh.
He was given a reprieve that his ALS is not necessarily going to be fatal. But he has a tremendous swelling, and you know him probably, Pokey, Kenneth James.
Oh,
He has
yes.
swelling in his feet, he has all this,
Yes.
he can't talk. He uses a typewriter to tell you what he wants to say.
Yep.
And I can't help but think about the other night, I was just hurting all over. Just, and I said, Ed, sometimes I just don't want to. He said, Francis, think about Kenneth James and what he puts up with and what he does and how he is a witness to everybody around him. He's 74 years old.
Yep.
He is beginning, he's going to build a building outside for something. I mean, his outlook on life is wonderful. He's enjoyed his grandchildren. He's had this for 20 or 25 years. And it is gradually getting worse. And you know, probably his system sometime will fail, but he's a beautiful testimony.
Yep.
Yeah, and a good demonstration of how God
Yes.
uses, you know, the passage that I like to quote often is in 1 Corinthians 1:27, where God shows the foolish things of the world to shame the wise and the weak things to shame the strong and so on. And sometimes we look at people like that and think, you know, really what use are they?
You think
And God
what-
says, no, man, I can use it. I
That's
can
it.
use those people.
That's it.
You just think about what his determination is, and he's enjoyed all this family and stuff, and they stood beside him. But thinking about medical tests and that kind of thing,
Yep.
our body is the temple of God, and
Right.
he told us to take care of it. And
Yep.
I think we need to do what
Yep.
we can to do that.
But I agree with you totally. If they all agree, Pokey, you're terminal, that's it. Nothing. Okay, fine. Then give me the pills and the shots and stuff, and I'm gonna go ahead as long as I can keep praising my God, and I hope when I lay on the deathbed, okay, boys, this is it. I'll see you next time I go to sleep. You know, that's it. Because I'm waiting on you. You know, really.
Yeah, and I think that's really the real key. I love
Absolutely.
what Paul writes where he says, I've learned to be content in
That's
every
it.
circumstance.
That's it.
Well, those
Exactly.
circumstances could be cancer.
Yep.
It
Yes.
could be, you know, whatever. And yet he says, I've learned to be content. He was comfortable. He was okay with leaving this earth, dying and
Exactly.
going on. But at the same time, you know, he recognized that God was still using him here. And I think we've got to do the same thing.
He didn't have the faith that God would take care of him. He had the faith in God to take care of him.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
There's a difference.
Yeah, you're right. There is, Ronnie.
Yeah.
And you know, I think as far as Pokey and Judy are concerned, it's kind of like we've talked about in here before too, is that, you know, that's a great testimony
Yes.
for him and Judy
Yes,
to
sir.
be able to witness to others. Because like you've said before, a
Mhm.
lot of people, when you lose your
Oh,
child,
man.
they get bitter.
Yes.
You know, and
Separation
just
and divorce 9 times
yeah,
out of 10.
That's exactly right.
And just
Yes.
to let people know that, you know, I still love God. I'm
Exactly.
not mad at God. And like you said, maybe you don't know sometimes when you're talking who's in the
That's
crowd.
who
Maybe
it
they
is,
go
right.
home
That's
and
exactly
think
right.
about it. You know, maybe I need to think about this.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I can tell you what comfort there is in that. You know, you hate to say it, but there's meaning in that cliche that says misery loves company.
Yes.
Well, I hate to say it. I remember, I've told you this before, but when Becky, my wife, passed, and I went to grief counseling, and they asked us why we were there, I didn't know at first. And then I realized why I was there. I wanted to hear that other people
Yes.
had loved and had lost and loved as deeply as I had. But I wasn't wanting other people to hurt. I just didn't want to be alone.
Yeah.
And so I found comfort in knowing that there were others. And so you can't imagine how much comfort you may be giving to others knowing that you've been there. They may be bitter, but when they hear
Absolutely.
that you've been through that, you know, it can change their whole outlook. Not only on life, but on God.
Yeah. I've never gone up to anybody and hugged them and told them, I know how you feel. No. But I have hugged them and told them, I buried my baby. And they hugged me tighter then. See? Absolutely.
Yeah,
Because
there's
it's different.
comfort in knowing that you're not
Absolutely. I
alone.
buried my baby, and Jesus loves you, and I love you, and absolutely, yeah, and that's, you know,
Yeah.
sure it means something, absolutely. It did to me and Judy. Several people came up to us at that time. Yes, sir, absolutely.
How old was your baby?
35. My baby was 6'3", 35 years old, and if you saw him, the first thing you'd say is, what team does he play on? He had a V, worked out, had a definition to him.
Looked about like you.
It looked a lot like me, yeah.
Wow.
I think my heavenly body's gonna be a lot like his. You know, I'll be at least 6'3", at least. But
That's
he-
the only chance I have of
That's
getting a
it.
body like
That's
that.
it. Then he was had a heart attack. 35 years, boom, dropped dead right there.
Yeah.
35 years old. Yep, that was my baby.
You'll
Yeah.
never know what you're going to be facing.
That's exactly
Yeah, that's right. You never know what our circumstances
You
are.
never know. I see it, buddy.
But you know, and also too, Tom, I've read this before that, you know, that we say our children or our, you know, they're not really ours.
Exactly, give from God.
They're not.
Absolutely.
God, they're God's.
Absolutely.
He made them.
Mm-hmm.
But they're mine to caretake for.
That's
Yeah.
it.
I think you've got an extremely good point there to make that
Absolutely.
we overlook often.
Yes, sir.
We deem them to be ours, but they're God's children, and God is a creator. He does whatever He wants.
Right.
And if
Uh-huh.
God deems to take His children, look at what took place with Job and all 10 of his children.
That's Old Testament.
That is Old Testament.
That's Old
By
Testament.
the
Also,
way,
Elizabeth gave Samuel.
yeah,
She did.
that's right. So, but yeah, I think what you're saying holds a lot of weight. I think that's a very strong point, that they're God's children.
That's right.
And while we do mourn for them, we miss them. If you
Sure.
can.
They're not yours.
They're not ours.
They're not yours.
Yeah.
That's exactly right.
The when you had that earlier on about serving God, earlier about like that's how we glorify God, is to serve Him.
Uh-huh.
I remember when I first got saved, my sister said, well, "You don't get saved by your works," and I knew I didn't get saved by my
Right.
works. But Frankie said, "Well, Gail, if you are saved and if you have the Holy Spirit, you want to do the works."
Absolutely.
of the Lord.
That's it.
You know,
There you go.
And I was really, I was like, well, yeah,
He's
I do.
right.
You know what I mean?
In fact, yeah, we're even going to mention that, but yeah, James, the Epistle of James speaks to that in chapter 2 very clearly. Well, today,
Well, I want to say what Kathy
said-
said.
Okay.
She had a real good point.
Okay.
Although they are his children, he doesn't expect us not to hurt
Of course.
and not to grieve.
Yes.
Because those are attributes of God
Absolutely.
too,
Absolutely.
caring and loving, and you know, He doesn't expect us not to be apathetic and not to hurt and not to care when we do lose a loved one.
That's
You know, I
Second
mean,
Well, see, Jesus himself cried.
because they are our children. He
Yeah.
did give them to us. They're God's, but they're ours too,
The
to take
caretaker.
care of. And when we do lose our loved ones,
Yeah.
you know, He knows that we're going to hurt and we're going to cry, and He expects that. But He does also know that He also expects us to know that He's there for us, and that He's going to get us through
That's
it.
just like I've always said, if anything
So.
happens to Justin, just go ahead and dig my grave.
Mhm.
But I mean, you know, Justin's not mine. It's just that I love him
Absolutely.
so
much. But believe me, you'll get by. I promise. I
Don?
promise. You'll
I
get-
think sometimes bad things come into our life so we can help people in
Yep.
the future. I.e. like 2 Corinthians, where
Exactly.
they say, "Blessed is the God of all comfort, who comforts us in our hour of needs and gives us comfort so that we can comfort others."
Mhm.
So, you know, as horrendous as it is, Pokey's son may have died so that later on he could help somebody else
Mhm.
out with the
Absolutely.
loss of a loved one that was very important.
Absolutely.
And that's why I think sometimes a lot of this happens.
Yeah, I agree with you.
I agree.
think very
Yeah,
truly.
really. Yes,
I
sir.
think that's how God causes all things to work together for good. He can take what we deem to be
That's
our
it.
worst situations and use those situations to glorify Himself.
When
That's
Bailey
it.
died,
Judy on the community.
people have called
Sure
Chris
is.
who had a child like that, and he can minister to them as nobody else can.
That's right. That's
Right,
exactly
right.
right. Chris has been there. That's
And it's
exactly.
glorifying God.
Absolutely.
Yeah, you're exactly right. I think you can use the example of somebody who's been on drugs and they're trying to get off. Me witnessing to them and somebody who's been born again,
Absolutely.
previously
There
drug
you
addict,
go.
they'll reach them a lot better than I will. Because I don't know what they've been through. Yeah.
You know, we've always heard it. God don't take you until He's ready to take you. And this is the God's truth. After we lost Matt, you would not believe the phone calls and the people that come up to us and total strangers that would call the house what Matt did for them.
Mm.
This one kid, long story short, Matt gave him a jacket. The fellow didn't have a jacket. And one Sunday, Judy and I were visiting Matt, and I took his car like I always do. Daddy, he was 35, I'm Daddy. I took his car, went and got me a coffee and put gas in it. Well, that afternoon, after we left, a buddy of his come by, had been laid off, blah, blah, blah. Matt gave him gas money. And I didn't know this until after my baby was buried. See, so I just smiled.
But
and
you
said,
see,
Absolutely, see?
He wasn't supposed to tell you.
That's what I
If
said.
he had told you, he'd been boasting.
Exactly,
about
see?
what you'd done.
Yeah, see, that's what I mean. It's,
Sort of paying it forward.
that's it, bud. That's exactly right.
About Agnes last night.
Yeah, you know?
Remember a story we heard? We went to Bible study last night. Me and Kathy was, we were doing Hebrews, and they were talking about this lady was on the plane, and this, she had earbuds on, trying not to listen to nobody, and so this little old lady come on with all these packages, hitting everybody, and she said she thought, oh, don't let her sit beside me because she'll want to talk.
Exactly.
So she said the woman, they were leaving Grand Rapids and going to Chicago, and she said the woman went, "Are you from Grand Rapids?" And she said, "No." And she put her earbud back in.
Uh-huh.
And then she said, "Are you from Chicago? Born in Chicago?" And the woman said, No,
No.
this is a Christian author.
I love it.
It's a spirit earbud
No.
thing. And then finally, she fell asleep. The woman was helping her, and she realized, I'm being rude. So she started talking to her, and she said, "Now, what's your name?" She said, "I'm Agnes, and I'm 83 years old."
Uh-huh.
And long story short, her husband, they had children. He wasn't saved, and then he got saved after they had children.
Mm-hmm.
And one of their sons had cerebral palsy. And then later on, her husband died in an accident at their home building, add on to the house, and her son died. And she said, "I didn't know what I was going to do." And she said, "Finally, God told me they wasn't mine. They were just mine for a short
That's
time."
it. Way to go.
Because she asked her, she said, "Well, where are you going?" She thought because they were ended up in Nashville. She said, "No, I'm going to India." And it was like,
I'm going to Mumbai, India, on a mission trip,
India.
83 years old.
She said, "To tell them about Jesus." And she said, "Boy, I did feel bad then."
Put her earbuds. I love
She
it.
said it was her 53rd trip to India.
That's
So-
great.
So that just shows you, you
Yeah, you never know.
you don't know what life's going.
That's right.
Yeah, you just never know.
You don't know. Sorry.
You don't happen to remember the lady's name, do you?
Agnes.
Agnes. That's
Oh,
what.
Agnes, okay.
Agnes. Yeah. Yeah.
But the lady with the earbuds was Lisa Harper, the one that we're studying.
Mhm.
Yeah. And she said, she traveled so much, was tired. And just,
Yeah. Well, I want to read you a few statements from those who are involved in Word Faith movement today in the 21st century, because today in our time frame, in the 21st century and in the 20th century, people tend to get this idea that life is all about pleasure and our happiness and being happy. And that our happiness and our comfort and our welfare is the most important thing that we could key in on, that we could deal with. And this is what it seems like we're finding in the church of the New Age today, in the 21st century. And so we had this uprising, this movement within the church that has been come to be identified as Word Faith or prosperity teachers and preachers and churches, identified as Word Faith churches and prosperity churches. And they're teaching that God wants you to be rich, and that if you're not rich or wealthy, or if you're in poor health, it's your own fault that you're not displaying enough faith. And they have come to this term called the name it and claim it preachers. Whereas if you want it, you want your billfold to be full, or you want better health, you name it, you claim it, and have enough faith that God will give that to you. And so we're in a society today, in this country particularly, where that type of preaching and teaching is very strong and growing by the numbers. I want to look at what is being taught by some of these people today, but some of you may, I brought the passage up in Matthew 7:7 that you may be wondering about, where the passage says, "Ask and it will be given to you, seek and you will find, knock and it will be open." And you wonder about that. People bring that up to sort of attack the Christian faith. Well, and even Word Faith preachers will use this to say, see, these are the words of Jesus himself. And he's saying, ask and you will receive. Well, I believe it's taken out of context and taken out of proper understanding.
Yes.
What I believe about that passage is that when we ask for it, it will be given to us. But I believe these words were meant for the believer, those who have given their life to Christ. I believe these words are meant for the true Christian, or they're meant for the true bride of Christ. And for those of us who make up the bride of Christ, then we will desire to do the will of Christ himself. And when we're given to Christ, when we desire to do his will, then I believe that which we ask will be given to us. But I believe that which we ask for will be within the will of God himself to give it. I think our desires become quite different than our earthly desires when we're given to Christ, when we become a true bride of Christ. And so I would believe that, yes, I think it is true. Ask and it will be given. But I think it's when it's within the will of Christ, meaning that when we're walking as the true bride of Christ, we'll desire what our groom desires for us, Christ himself.
But it doesn't say, Tom, ask for all the money you want and I'll give it.
That's it.
not
Right.
what it says. People get hung up on that, but that's not what it says. It says ask and it will be given to you, but it doesn't say all the money
Right.
that you want or.
And
I've
it's
always
even
thought that the
about
reason I don't have a lot of money is
material
because
material.
I think it would destroy me. I don't think
Destroy
I
anybody.
think I would do things with it, but you know what we think we do if we had it
Yeah.
could be totally different from
Just
what
look
we
at
do.
people win lotteries.
Mhm.
Yeah, and how many people that wealth has changed? Because I want
Yes.
to read you some of these things, Don.
Well, I guess I never looked at it in money. For me, the hardest test I had in my life was when my grandmother passed when I was in 9th grade. And when she was sick, I can't tell you how hard I prayed that she would not go.
Mm-hmm.
And I asked, and I asked, and I asked, and the answer was no. Because she died.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a very hard time in my life to try to comprehend and understand that. I mean, I watched other people go, but this was different. You know, if you knew my grandmother, you would know why it was so different. But it didn't happen. So I had doubts for a while that, you know, how can they say this, ask and it'll be given it to you. I asked for this, it didn't happen. And like you said, it wasn't in God's will at that time.
That's it right there.
That's
You know,
right.
so it's kind of a crutch to fall back on, you know.
Right.
You know, like the guys that try to burn the little fire thing, ball and whatever, and the one guy said, you know, hey, throw water on it, and boom, his lit up being the one true God. You know, you can't fall.
Oh, yeah, you're talking about
Elijah.
Elijah.
Yeah, Elijah when he had the pillar of fire. You know, the other one could say, hey, well, I asked my God, and he said, no,
Yeah,
you know.
yeah. They say, well, maybe he's asleep.
Yeah.
Talk louder. Well, some of these, Francis, you can turn it off and back on if you need to, if it's
Okay.
during the time.
I
Francis?
think when we ask, give us what we need.
Yeah.
And not what we want.
Yeah.
That's right.
But if we, like you said, are truly Christian, we're gonna forget about all this material stuff.
Exactly.
We get
Mhm.
into scriptures and study and follow the Bible. You forget all that stuff.
Mhm.
And He provides for you all the time. And I have seen in times, you know, you do something for somebody and you're rewarded. But it's rewarded up here or in your heart or whatever, rather than in your pocketbook.
Yeah.
It's all in the,
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that so often when we think of asking, we most generally think materially speaking. And I think when we're truly walking with Christ, the material world won't be a part of our world. You know, we'll desire that which Christ desires, and it will not be material. But I think we tend to think materially. But yeah, Tina.
I think what Pastor Miguel prayed at Lee Park Alive,
Mhm.
praying for the
Yeah.
woman with cancer.
Mm-hmm.
You know, he asked God for that favor. He asked God for permission that God might let this be. But he wasn't presuming on God, that God was just going to
Yeah.
do this because there's so many people praying for her. You know, God's answer still might be no.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's right.
Yeah, and I think we can learn from the prayer that Jesus taught his disciples.
Yeah.
You know, when you pray, say, "Our Father which art in heaven,
Mhm.
and Thy will be done, and Thy kingdom come." And I think we can learn from that. You know, we should seek, and I think if we're truly walking in Christ, that's what we'll really want. That will be our desire: is Thy will to be done.
That's right.
You know, we were talking about that last week. I believe that we will freely give up our free will and surrender to the will of Christ. And when our will desires that which is the will of Christ, then I think when we ask, it will be given. But I think it's only when we're in accord with Christ. Well, I want to read you some of these comments from some of these Word Faith preachers. You know, some of them, I put some names up here. Kenneth Copeland stands out.
What about Joel Osteen? Is he considered?
Joel Osteen, yeah, but he's a lightweight compared to some of these other guys.
Are you serious?
Oh, yeah. Creflo Dollar, Benny Hinn, Paula White. Let me just read you a sample. Here's what they're preaching. This from Kenneth Hagin. If anybody anywhere will take the 4 steps that I write about in my book and put those principles into operation, he will always receive whatever he wants from me or from God the Father. This includes what you want financially.
Man.
Now, these are taken from their sermons. This from Marilyn Hickey. What do you need? Start creating it. Start speaking about it. Start speaking it into being. Speak to your billfold. Say, you big, thick billfold full of money. Speak to your checkbook. Say, you checkbook, you've never been so prosperous since I owned you. You're just jammed full of money. Now, they're teaching that today. They're preaching that. Here's Creflo Dollar. There is no such thing as deliverance in the physical, natural realm aside from your mouth. Your mouth is connected to your life. Use it. Speak what you want and you'll get it. Even death and life are in the power of the tongue. You want to live? Speak it.
Yeah, but what happens if you don't want to die?
Speak it.
Exactly.
There seems to be a flaw in their teaching there. Here's Frederick Price. Now this is a shocker. But God has to be given permission to work in this earth realm on behalf of man. Yes. You are in control, not God. So if man has control, who no longer has it? God. When God gave Adam dominion, that meant God no longer had dominion. So God cannot do anything in this earth unless we let him. And the way we let him or give him permission is through prayer.
I would be scared to death.
Me too.
Folks, these pastors are bringing in thousands.
Yes.
Yeah, they are.
Yeah.
I just watched a sermon from Creflo Dollar the other night. It was at, not the MGM Grand, but another huge, in New York. What's a big?
Madison Square Garden.
Madison Square Garden. Yeah, thousands and thousands. Here's Benny Hinn. I'm sick and tired of hearing about streets of gold. I don't need gold in heaven. I got to have it now. You want it now, don't you? When I get to glory, all my bills will be paid, brother. I won't have bills in glory. I won't need to worry about bills in glory. I got to have it here and now. You say, well, Benny Hinn, isn't it wonderful to have streets of gold in heaven? Well, of course. But if I hear the thing one more time of how it will be in heaven, I'm going to kick somebody.
Really?
Here's Frederick Price. If the mafia can ride around in Lincoln Continental town cars, why can't the King's kid? You can talk about me all you want while I'm driving in my Rolls Royce that's paid for. Talk all you want. Badmouth all you want. It don't hurt me in the least. The Bible says that he has left us an example that we should follow his steps. That's the reason why I drive a Rolls Royce. I'm following Jesus' steps.
Jesus didn't have a place to live.
Benny Hinn says, years ago they used to preach, oh, we are going to walk on streets of gold. But I would say, don't need the gold up here. I got to have it down here.
He's hung up on that.
Here's Juanita Bynum. You watching me in television land and you saying, all I got is $900. But I hear the Lord saying, I double dog dare all of you who are watching right now to empty your checking account. If you got $79, empty it out. Send it into our ministry.
God.
Empty your pockets out at the voice of the prophet.
Oh my God.
Sounds like Jim Baker.
Here's another Juanita Bynum.
Yeah.
If God's not going to work for you, why serve him?
Man.
Really?
Here's Kenneth Copeland again. God's on the outside looking in. He doesn't have any legal entry into the earth. The thing don't belong to him. You see how sassy the devil was in the presence of God in the book of Job? God said, where have you been? Wasn't any of God's business. He, Satan, didn't even have to answer if he didn't want to. God didn't argue with him a bit. You see, this is a position that God's been in. Might say, well, if God's running things, he's doing a lousy job of it. He hadn't been running them except when he's just got, a little bit of a chance. Kenneth Copeland. Here's Rod Parsley. Why does God say, ask of me? Why does he say that? Because he can't do it on his own. He can't get what he wants on his own because he placed you in authority on this earth. Do you hear me? He placed you in charge on this earth. Here's Miles Monroe. I'm going to say it again. Prayer is man giving God authority or God license to interfere in the affairs of man. In fact, God, I'm going to take a deep breath because some of you religious people aren't going to understand me. Are you ready? God cannot do anything in the earth without a human's permission.
Man.
Kenneth Copeland. God intends for every believer to live completely free from sickness and disease. It is up to you to decide whether or not you will. If you claim it and have enough faith, you will live free from sickness. Here's Benny Hinn again. Every time you hold back your money, my friend, heaven will charge you 20% whether you like it or not. In fact, if you don't send it in, God will take it away from you through tragedy. Don't you ever forget that. Yes, that's what the Word says. I want to see that passage.
Really?
God will take it away from you through troubles.
Would you look that up for us, Tom?
Yeah, I'd like to know where that's at. Here's Kenneth Copeland again. When we use the spiritual laws that God has set up, God must obey what we request. And here's Kenneth Copeland again. You don't have the God in you. You are one.
One day they will
He
get
must be
signed.
Mormon. He must be Mormon.
I would be.
Yeah.
I would be
Yeah,
scared.
yeah. Well, I just said that this stands in contrast to the words of Jesus, who says, "Do not lay up for yourselves treasures upon earth, where moth or rust destroy and where thieves
That's
break in
right.
and steal." I just made a note that the irreconcilable difference between word faith teaching and the gospel of Christ is summed up in the words of Jesus. You cannot serve God and riches. I know we're getting close on time, but I want you to hear those things. That's 21st century word faith teaching and preaching today. Those quotes are not made up.
Mm-hmm.
Those were actually spoken. You want to read a book that will just shake you to your bones. Hanegraaff,
Hank.
Hank Hanegraaff, thank you. Hank Hanegraaff has a great book that he published several years ago called Christianity in Crisis. And it's aimed at looking at word faith teachers and prosperity teachers. We generally tend to think of, what's his name, Joel Osteen. But as I said, Joel's a lightweight compared to these
You know
guys.
what, his wife isn't. She went on recently
Yeah.
and said that about, obeying God isn't about God.
She stepped out beyond him, I believe.
Yes.
Yeah.
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 Wow.
Yeah, it's going crazy.
Yeah.
And like you said, it's amazing at the followers.
Really?
Exactly.
Really?
Because
Yes.
because he's saying what everybody wants
That's
to
it.
hear.
Yeah.
You're exactly right. That's what people want to hear, and that brings people in.
Can you imagine how God feels? I mean, can you just
Really?
imagine?
He already knows.
Yeah.
Yeah, he knows, but I
He
mean,
knows
my
when they
goodness.
won't believe
I mean,
in pure
He's
doctrine.
probably
but
telling
wanting
his
to
son
have
to
their
get
ears
ready because
tickled.
it's
Yeah,
not like
exactly.
He may be. That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Tickle it the way they want
Uh,
to tickle.
Yeah.
Well, some
Well,
of it
it's-
almost sounds satanic. It's almost
Yes,
like.
it
Really?
does, Francis.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
does. You're right. I quoted 1 Timothy 6:10 here, which we're familiar with. For the love of money is a root of all sorts of evil, and some, by longing for it, have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. And I just put a note in here. I personally think that almost all sin can be traced to two things: the pride of the heart and the love of money.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think if you really sit down and think about any type of sin, you can trace it back to the pride of the
Well,
heart.
in those very words in Timothy or something?
Yeah, this is in 1 Timothy.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, right. There was a survey done by the George Barna Group. Is an incredible research group out in Ventura, California. They do a lot of Christian type of research on all sorts of different things. And one of the studies that they did was to sample a large number of those people, men and women, who have become, I guess you would call it, independently wealthy. Wealthy enough that they don't have to worry about money any longer. And one of the interesting things I found from this study is that the vast majority of these people who had reached that point financially confessed that they really had no need for God. They either weren't interested in God or they had no need for God. But even more interesting in the study, because the research went even further, what they discovered from an interview with these people that they sampled is that most of them confessed that they had that they never have found fullness in their life. There's something that they can't even identify that is missing in their life. So even with all the money that they have, all the wealth, they've generally confessed that there's something lacking in their life. They generally don't go as far as to recognize that's lacking as being God, but they do recognize that there's something lacking in their life. and they can't identify what it is. Well, I just think that survey results are interesting when you look back at this passage that Paul writes, for the love of money is a root of all sorts of evil, and some, by longing for it, have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. Well, that's a grief if you recognize there's something missing in my life and I don't know what it is. And I got all this money, but there's something missing.
Mhm.
That certainly is a grief. And I just think it's interesting how we can see the Bible coming alive through examples here in the 21st century of people. But that's what we're facing, and that's what our young people are growing up with. As they go today off to colleges and universities, and finding their own churches, many of them are finding these word faith churches, and as Betty, I think, said, people are attracted to churches and congregations where they're teaching what it is they want to hear.
Mm-hmm.
People want to hear, how can I get rich? How can I be happy? And so they're finding that, and that's why if look, sometimes you can go on YouTube and pull up some of these Benny Hinn and Kenneth Copeland and so forth, and what you'll find looking out, not just listening to their sermons, but look how many people are attending these
Really?
things. I mean, they're loaded.
It looks like a coliseum, just
Exactly.
full of people.
Yeah.
Really.
And then we look at our classes here, and we have so few people.
That's it.
And yet, so if I were to start teaching and preaching word faith, maybe we could fill the house up, you know?
It goes to show you who's hungry for the word and who's not.
That's it.
Word.
Yeah,
exactly.
Who's hungry for the word.
Yeah, you're right, Francis.
I don't know if anybody saw it last night or yesterday. They interviewed Bill Gates.
Yes.
And he's making money faster than he can give it away.
Really?
Like, he made several, 20
Billions.
billion or something last
Billion.
year.
Billion?
Yeah.
But he gave 20 or some such for Ebola
Mhm.
research and
Mhm.
money to actually be, and he says he hopes that will be eradicated or controlled within 6 months.
Mhm.
I love to see people who have money that do something with
Yes.
it that helps other
Really?
people. I don't have a problem with people having money.
There you
If they help other people who don't have it. And that's what we're supposed to do.
He's been doing this a long
Yeah.
time.
Oh,
He
yeah.
doesn't get
Yeah,
know
exactly.
a lot
Yes.
about him.
And
He's
Well,
helped
whereas, you know, I was so shocked to see him come out for this, but it's so important that he gets that mission done for Ebola.
And I think it was Rockefeller. I think when he was raising his children, he made them take out off the top 10%. Now, it wasn't tithing, but he made them cut off 10% of what they earned just to show them that they could live on the 90% and not always have the 100.
That's it.
Pretty fascinating.
I think J.C. Penney or something gave tithe his money, and all, when he ended up at the end of his life, he was tithing 90%
God.
and keeping just 10.
God.
And yet,
Yeah, Bill Gates gives away and I believe that's what they saying now. We can't think of that. $4 million a day. Like you said, billions.
Yeah.
He makes billions, and he gives away $4 million a day. And I can't. No, I'm a dollar guy. But
Too many zeros.
I'm serious. But I thought, golly. But now, I told Shirley one time, and I understand what Miss Shirley said, absolutely. But there's no doubt in my mind. Now, I don't play the lottery, maybe once a year when the mega big thing, But I do believe if I played it and hit it, I do believe I'd go to Chris Justice tomorrow and say, build it and send me the bill. I really do.
We probably wouldn't see you no more.
No, I'm serious, I really do. I think I would do that.
Another
Sure you
person
would,
is
Pope.
the
Bye,
You know
Angie.
you would.
Thanks for being here.
Bye, Angie.
The Levine family has.
Yes.
so much
Yeah, they
Yeah,
knowledge
exactly right.
in
Yes.
our area with their
Grandbabies.
Bye, y'all.
Yes, sir. Yes.
without,
Yeah, Frank, we missed it.
Levine Cancer Center.
things.
Yeah, yeah.
It's the side of money they've given.
They
away,
have,
too.
yes.
You can turn that off now, Kevin, if you don't mind. Well, the class is going crazy, and